This is actually Lauren. I was able to snap a picture of her because once we walked in, she started like fiddling with the exhibit and trying to make sure everything was in the right place. The artifacts that she constructed, she fabricated things that look real, but of course they're not of our world. I just want to talk about a few of those, and then we can kind of ease into this conversation about police and abolition and all the rest of it. So things like this book, which I thought was a real book because it was nestled amongst other real books, right? The Rise and Fall of Policing in America, things like that, where you see it and you're like, wait a minute, is this a real book or is it something that she's fabricated, right? This check, $1,000 check from the U.S. Treasury Department to the resident of this particular space, we could assume. Is it a UBI, like Universal Basic Income check that's been issued to this person, right? There's also this, which I didn't notice the first time I went through. There's a collection of currency. So we see American currency in one spot, but you also see a localized currency of the same mold as what used to be called Ithaca hours. Ithaca, New York had its own local currency. And the whole idea was that if you get paid sort of half in dollars, half in Ithaca hours, you'll spend those Ithaca hours locally. So it's a way to boost local businesses. It circulates locally. And so in this space, you see something that's called Great Lakes Equitable Time, right? Local currency. And this is an interesting plot that kind of weaves itself throughout the entire space. In one corner, there's a quilt and a sewing machine that seems like it's being, this person left the work in motion. Elsewhere, you find a funeral program that belongs to or was for a older Black woman who died. And in her obituary, it says that she was somebody who started local quilting circles and then eventually grew those circles into a political party that gained power within Detroit, right? And so as you walk in, you're like, wait a minute, this person who lives in here may be a member of this political party, right? Because of the quilt. And then things like this, right? So two interesting artifacts in this one frame, in the foreground of the flaming hot Fritos, with Fritos spelled like freedom. And then what you learn when you inspect the bag, of course, you're not supposed to touch it, when you look closer at the bag, is that they were manufactured in Detroit, east to with it, right? For residential or neighborhood development. And it says this is the 10th year straight that Detroiters have, have been doing participatory budgeting in the city. On one of the back pages, there's another headline that reads, cooperatives rule Detroit's restaurant scene, these worker-run enterprises. So it was interesting to be in that space, right? Like I said, it was like stepping into some future moment that doesn't quite exist. And there's a lot of ground that I share with Lauren, right? Lauren is somebody who is maybe more committed to an abolitionist politics than I am. I can talk about my misgivings, and we'll just sort of talk a little bit about them later on in this discussion. But one of the things that we get from her is that this is a Detroit which is better. And it's better because the economy is different, right? The economy is now, at least in some places, in some moments, governed by its people, controlled by its people, and not by capital, right? And so it's interesting that she was able to create this view into a possible future. When we stepped outside of that space, right? Of course, we're back in gentrification land. And as we're walking around, there's all sorts of great murals, which we see in a lot of urban spaces that have been gentrified. They remind us of the kind of peoples that once, occupied these spaces. This is an image of Jay Dilla, right, who is really important for a lot of different reasons. One, for being one of the greatest beat makers and producers of his time. Detroit native son. He didn't live very long, born in 1974. He dies as a result of various health complications in 2006. And what's interesting is that his life, actually his birth date and death date, are bookends for Black Detroit and Black power within Detroit, right? If you think about it in this way, he's born the year that Coleman Young becomes mayor. And he dies very much on the eve of the subprime mortgage crisis, right? Right before, Detroit, Black homeownership is decimated, right? As a result of the subprime crisis. Some of my family members were affected by that moment. But I thought it was interesting to see, Jay Dilla represented within this gentrifying space. And I think one of the things that I have in common with Lauren, right, is that we have to be critical of the remaking of cities, that it is a part of the story of policing and the problems of policing in this particular moment. Where I probably differ from Lauren, and she already knows this, right, is that I may have a little bit more old school democratic socialist blood running through my veins, right? That I still believe there's a place for popular power and important and critical state interventions. As I like to tell people, I think my ideas are closer to those of the old urbanist Henri Lefebvre, who said that, I'm a Marxist so that one day we can all be anarchists, right? So I don't consider myself an abolitionist, and I'll try to make some critical comments in that direction towards the end. But before I do that, let's talk about some core questions that I hope we can answer in the time that we have. I'm going to give you some answers, but I want you all to give me some answers as well once we get into the Q&A. So the first question, how did we get here? Why are we in this space where in the US we've come to expect way more police killings of civilians per year than any other wealthy comparative country? So how did we get here? What is to be done in terms of solutions? What is to be done about police? I'll try to quickly rehearse near the very end some of the different reformists, abolitionists, and other alternatives. And then the money question, who is going to do it? It's not a battle that can be completely won in the streets, as we saw back in 2020. Some of the largest wave of protest demonstrations in the country's history. Every zip code, every state, we saw things happening. But yet, we're still very much in the same space we were before George Floyd was killed. So I'll take the lead. I'll offer some views, but I expect to hear, other people offer some alternatives as well. So how did we get here? Right? I'm actually going to give you a different account. I'm not going to go back to slavery. It's not about patty rollers. This is not about the 13th Amendment or about convict leasing, even though those are all forms of carceral control. That the unique problems of policing that we face now were generated much later in time. So I'm going to focus more so on the post-war period. But let me offer some criticisms of the popular explanations before we get into it, because these are the ones that prevail, right? And many people believe this. I mean, I can't tell you how many folks I've bumped into, friends, old coaches, family members. Everybody can kind of repeat some of these new Jim Crow or Black Lives Matter arguments. And the reality is they do capture a reality, right? They capture a certain portion of what's happening, in particular in urban areas, right? In the urban theater. Now, how do we end up at this place where new Jim Crow, Black Lives Matter are the dominant ways of thinking about mass incarceration and policing? Part of it has to do with who were the first people to mount a critical assault on the expansion of policing and prisons, right, in this country. And those are Black civil rights organizations, Black students, Black communities, neighborhoods, and people of a certain age in the room. I won't call you out. And recall that moment, right, in the 1980s, when we didn't use the term mass incarceration. We didn't know it yet. But we could feel that something was happening that was not right, right? You saw more and more in the way of police killings of Black civilians. Civil rights organizations are speaking out against this. Rap artists are talking about this. Black college students, Black students on white universities are talking about these issues as each new case arises, right? Even people like Jean-Michel Basquiat, who I just saw an exhibition that was pulled together by his family in LA. He was talking about, mass incarceration in the context of not mass incarceration, but policing in the context of New York City. So Black activists, Black organizations are the first to frame this problem. And they frame it in the ways that made the most sense, right? They were talking about cities, they were talking about Black victims. And so that was the way that they characterized it. And in many places, Black Lives Matter and new Jim Crow frames totally work. So in Chicago, Illinois, if you think back the last sort of half decade or so, 74% of the people who've been killed by police have been African Americans in a city where Blacks only make up about 1/3 of the total population. In terms of harassment stops, meaning stops where people are pulled over by police, questioned, maybe their tags are run, their license is run, but they're let go. We're looking at 72% again of African Americans of the total people who are stopped. That's a gross disproportionality, gross injustice in terms of how people are being treated. One of the issues I bring up in the book, however, is that when we move outside of places like Chicago or Baton Rouge or Detroit, different geographies emerged, right? We begin to see other people who are being routinely arrested. I mean, I saw here in Arizona, right? Whites still make up about 40% of the prison population, right? Why is that? And what do they have in common with Blacks and Latinos and Indigenous people who are also incarcerated? This is one of the issues that I want us to think about. So an image and maybe misrepresented and misunderstood image as well, right? I'll talk about that. But there's been difficulty talking about class, not just during the time of Black Lives Matter, but really since the Cold War in the US, right? I mean, we're a country that started out, it's established through a bourgeois revolution. So class has never been something that people want to abide, right? It's always the sense that class doesn't really matter in the US in the ways it does in other places. If anything, it just adds some dynamism to your story. It won't stop you from becoming successful. It won't stop you from becoming wealthy. But during the Cold War, the very political notions of class consciousness are pretty much expunged from popular and polite conversation. And many Americans' commitments to capital are deepened, primarily through the expansion of the consumer society. Now, a standard line is that happens for whites, but not for Black people. And that's partially true. But we need to be more specific, right? So the expansion of the consumer society does happen. Whites benefit, many do, not all. And the civil rights movement comes about mainly as a means of gaining access to that consumer society, right? Think about the major pitched battles of the civil rights movement. They were fought in consumer spaces, right? At lunch counters, in department stores, public pools, vacation areas, hotels, right? So this was trying to crack open and expand the consumer society so everybody could take part in it. When you look at this image, right, there's a sharp juxtaposition, right? We see the promotion of the American, good life in this, billboard that was put out by the Manufacturers Association. And then below it, we see Black people who are dressed very much like the people in the image, right? But they're waiting in a queue and clearly in need of some sort of support. Anybody know what this is depicting? What's the context of this particular image? It was taken in 1937. It's called the Louisville Flood. And these are Black people who are waiting for flood relief, emergency relief from the state. So even when we look at it, it sort of reeks of Jim Crow segregation, right? And on the one side, there's like Black people at the bottom, struggling, waiting, and then the American dream being projected up top. These are people who actually are receiving support from the state. And I don't want us to lose sight of that. There's inequalities, but we should be able to talk about these things at the same time, keep both ideas in our heads at the same time. Because I think if we don't, we miss some important things about the mid-century changes, really going back to the Great Depression, political changes. So my claim here is that liberal anti-racism is not enough in this moment, not as an interpretive or way of thinking about history, but certainly not as a politics, right? And that we have to do much more. Let me keep going. There were some other points I was going to make, but I want to make sure that we get it all in. So part of what I'm trying to lay out in this book, and I'm going to do it in brief here, is the class character of policing. When I'm talking about class, I don't mean income, right? I don't mean wealth as income plus assets. Those are indicators or metrics that you can use to talk about class. But I'm really talking about social relations, right? The different roles that groups play in the production and distribution of goods and services in the society. Now, one of the problems of the Black Lives Matter moment and why we miss the class character is that the way that we receive the information about who's being brutalized, who's being hurt, it's highly selective, and it follows the dynamics and frames and problems of social media, right? Everything, we're not presented with the entire world in social media. It's curated, it's diluted, it's sensational. There's all sorts of elements that come into play. But seeing is believing. So if I see a video, if I see 10 videos of Black people getting brutalized by police, I'm thinking, of course, I've seen it. It's happening. But there are many more incidents of police violence, even against Black people, that aren't depicted on camera and aren't circulated by way of social media. So we have a distorted picture of what actually is happening, and we're only mobilizing around certain cases, depending on the specific dynamics, right? So there's situations where some Black people have been armed. Those don't circulate in the same ways. It's not the kind of stark George Floyd moment where it's like there's no equivocation. It's just clear. This person should not have been treated in this way. So the ones that have much more ambiguity are more difficult to mobilize around, and they slip out of frame. Let me give you one quick example of this. During the July 4th weekend, a week of 2016, remember this? This was like the moment in the summer when nobody thought in hell that Donald Trump was going to become the president of the United States, right? We didn't believe it. We couldn't believe it. So many people didn't want to believe it, right? Maybe in this state, folks believed it, right? But when we think about that week, this was the week that Alton Sterling was killed by Baton Rouge police. It's also the week that Philando Castile is killed outside St. Paul, Minnesota. During that same week, a total of 10 people were killed by police nationally. I'll read the names out to you, right? Delron Small in Brooklyn, Dylan Noble in Fresno, California, Anthony Nunez in San Jose, California, Pedro Eric Villanueva in the Canoga Park section of Los Angeles, Raul Saavedra Vargas in Reno, Nevada, Melissa Ventura in Yuma County, Arizona, Vincent Ramos in Los Angeles County, Alva Brazil in Houston. So in total, 4 Black men, disproportionality for sure, 1 white youth, and 5 Latinos killed in that week. But we don't know the names of these other people or the details, like most of us don't know. Why is that? And what is it about all of these cases? Where's the common thread, right? This is where the class character of policing comes into play. What I think we're talking about, and I'm going to take us back through some post-war history to show this, we're not talking about a policing apparatus that's strictly trained upon Black people. This is the old war on drugs argument, and it is partially true. What we're looking at, for the most part, is the policing of relative surplus population. This is a concept that I'll try to flesh out in the next few minutes. We're looking at people who have been made obsolete by this particular moment of technological development within capital accumulation. And we're looking at people who are either dependent on criminalized forms of work, engaged in survival crimes, or they just simply live in places where those sorts of activities might be dominant, or happen to be in those spaces where those activities might be dominant. Of course, there's exceptions, right? Tamir Rice, he was a kid playing in the park with a gun, with a handgun, right, or a toy gun. So there's plenty of examples we can point to where it's involving, it's totally absurd. But by and large, a lot of the people we're talking about, and I'll give you some examples, are people who represent the most submerged and vulnerable elements of the working class. And I'm saying that not to demonize them. I'm not making a fraternal order to police argument, but to try to situate who they are and why we should really be concerned about their lives and what we can do to make their lives so much better. So where does the problem start? For me, it starts in the post-war context. where American cities are radically transformed. So after World War II, we see the birth of both the consumer society or expansion of the consumer society, the birth of suburbia as we know it, even though there were streetcar suburbs before, people lived level. There's a quote, I don't know if people can actually see it here, from Franklin Roosevelt, who sees the expansion of consumer capacity as an important way of safeguarding against this problem of surplus absorption. We have this big manufacturing economy. We need people who can purchase these things and avoid potential, economic downturns. So there are many elements of society that are moving in the direction of supporting, expanded consumerism. And after World War II, in the midst of the presidency of Harry Truman, when we get the Fair Deal, we also get the 1949 Housing Act, which is incredible because it earmarks a few different important things that happen in restructured cities. On the one hand, you get funds for urban renewal. You also have, expansion of the Federal Housing Authority, Housing Administration lending program, and you get money earmarked for the construction of public housing, right? So as my good friend Toure Reed likes to say, on the one side, you have, in the same bill, whites get suburbs, poor blacks get public housing, right? In the same bill in 1949. It sets the country on an important path. And I think, helps to produce so many of the problems and ghosts that we're still struggling with. So many ways we think about cities, good and bad, that are still with us. Now, I don't want to take the narrative too far, right? Even though I love Toure's quip. There's contradictions as well. So again, keeping two ideas in your head at the same time. So yes, by and large, places like Levittown, suburbs that are springing up all over the country, whites are the main patrons. Not all whites, keeping in mind some are left behind in the cities. There's also some Black suburban and Black middle class development that's happening as well. This is one good example, Pontchartrain Park. It's a subdivision that was opened in 1955, right next to Gentilly Woods, white subdivision in New Orleans. If you like the actor Wendell Pierce, he was on The Wire, Bunk Moreland, right? He grew up in that neighborhood. So did Terrence Blanchard, the jazz trumpeter who's done a lot of the scores for Spike Lee films, right? The Morial family lived in this subdivision. If you were to drive 60, 70 miles north to New Orleans, from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, you find Southern Heights, another Black subdivision that's built for Black government bureaucrats and teachers, professors. So there's some expansion among Blacks, but of course it's not the same, right? It's not comparable in the same ways. But I want us to keep that in mind, right? That it's not an all or nothing story, and that people are fighting. This is the important part that's missing from a lot of accounts and write-offs of the New Deal. There's limitations within the first couple of waves of legislation under Roosevelt, but part of what we need to keep in mind is that many Black activists saw that as an opportunity. They didn't think about it as like, oh, we've been defeated, New Deal is so racist, let's just go home. It actually inspires not only for people to become Democrats, let's keep that in mind, but they also begin to push for expansion of programs, desegregation of the military. In many ways, it sets the stage for the kind of post-World War II civil rights activism that would happen. Just on a personal note, I'll just say this. Executive Order 8802, it mattered, right? Desegregation of defense industries. My grandmother worked in Brooklyn Air Force Base from the 1940s until that base was shut down as an electroplater, right? Black woman from Kentwood, Louisiana, working in this factory, was able to also get her husband a job in the same base, same factory. And she worked on the assembly line, right? And I think he had more of a desk job or technical job. But people benefited, not to the degree that we may have wanted, but I think we should keep that in mind. But this is one of the problems, right? This is what happens with the expansion of suburbs and, again, the resegregation of Blacks within central cities. This is where we get the term the thin blue line. It actually comes into being during this period. The white guy in the picture is William H. Parker, who served as the top cop for Los Angeles from 1950 to 1966. And, you know, in the picture, he's posing with Black officers. They did hire Black officers in Los Angeles. They had been hiring them for like maybe 30 to 40 years before that. I think actually the first officer they hired was in the late 19th century. But they wanted Blacks who could manage, you know, the Black population, right? What should we say about Parker? He was a World War II veteran. And he came into office with some really clear ideas about what police should be, right? Police should have a dual role, right? They should be role models for middle-class virtue. And he felt that the thin blue line was the police, right? The police are a thin blue line standing between middle-class life, American middle-class life, which is virtuous, and various forms of corrupting influences in the society. And for him, those were godless communism, it's the midst of the Cold War, organized crime, which many people had a problem with at the time, for good reasons, and also the large numbers of Black working class folks who are moving into the Watts section of Los Angeles at that time, like my aunts and uncles who were coming from Louisiana and Texas. He's worried about the disruptive potential they can have, right? These people who have very little, who are now placing strain on, you know, what he saw as this idyllic, you know, middle class context. And so Parker, you know, was opposed during this time. One person in particular who stood up to Parker was Tom Bradley, who became the first, you know, was a beat cop during Parker's reign. He becomes the first Black mayor of Los Angeles. He serves as the mayor of Los Angeles longer than anyone else, from 1973 to 1993. And when he was a beat cop, he really went at, you know, William H. Parker for his treatment of Black people. But this is the beginnings, right? This is the beginnings of the kind of policing that we're accustomed to seeing. Parker actually helped to institute the use of police cruisers, right? The use of cars, automobiles to manage vast urban space. He believed in public relations and tried to use, you know, television and radio to promote a certain image of police officers. He was an advisor to the show, you know, Adam 12, and also the other really popular show, Dragnet, right? If you go to the Los Angeles Police Museum, there's actually a case dedicated to Dragnet and Adam 12, right? You should check out that museum. It's really great in the most diabolical of ways. But the thin blue line, right? This is the beginnings of it, right? This is the beginnings of a certain mode of policing that's very different from what was happening before, right? So one way we can distinguish them, if you think about police during the early industrial period in the United States, they're primarily concerned with a couple of things, you know, and both of them directly connected to the workings of manufacturing capital, right? They're concerned with crushing labor rebellion, which they do, with the use of also hired hands, you know, hired guns by the factory bosses. And we're doing things like at this moment in the 1950s and 60s. They're really like the old coal, you know, the canary in the coal mine, if you think about that analogy, right? People are familiar with that. Older folks are, right? Let me rehash it quickly. You know, at one time, it's a primitive kind of technology. Miners who went down in the coal mine brought along a canary inside of a cage, right? And because the canary was so much smaller and its lungs so much more delicate, it would feel changes in the air conditions of the mine shaft much quicker, right? And so if the canary gets sick or dies, the miners know it's time to get the hell out of the shaft, right? Because it may have poisonous or hazardous conditions, right? Blacks, in many ways, working class Blacks living in cities, not the ones who were moving into Pontchartrain Park at that time, are those miners canaries within the United States, right? They're some of the first people to feel the shocks and dislocations of deindustrialization. And like I said, one of the most important folks for me in terms of thinking about this is James Boggs, who was a Chrysler auto worker. He starts out in Alabama, Marion Junction, Alabama. He basically hobos his way around the country in search of work, like a lot of people. You know, he talks about these things, what it was like to live through the Depression and look for work, look for a meal. But Boggs makes his way to Detroit, becomes a Chrysler auto worker. He eventually, marries Grace Lee, and they live this really rich intellectual, partnership, activist partnership that lasts until his death in the 90s. But for the purpose of this talk, one of his greatest books, most helpful books, is a book which came out in 1963 called The American Revolution. And I'll try to give you a quick and dirty summary of what he's talking about here. So one of the main things he's concerned about is the challenge of automation. It's a Black auto worker in Detroit. And he's concerned about the changes that automation is producing within the plant where he works. But he's also concerned about what it's doing outside the plant, outside the factory gates. So one thing that Boggs says is that the old rivalries that used to matter so much on the factory floor don't matter as much anymore, right? With automation. Automation has sort of swept aside the old ethnic rivalries, which used to dominate and make it difficult to organize as a union. And now, you've got people who are really divided more so by seniority, right? Those workers who've been there long enough to have gained a better, standard of living as a result of previous contracts, and those newcomers who are now struggling for, basic things. He also says that, outside of the factory, he's seeing changes that have been produced or provoked by automation, and what he also refers to as cybernetics or cybernation, right? The use of computers to manage work and make it more efficient. Outside the factory, he's beginning to see more and more young Black men who are standing around on street corners in Detroit, and he refers to them as expendables, untouchables, and outsiders, and at other places as disposable people. Right, that unlike himself, who came into Detroit at the perfect time, he's able to, get a foot in the factory, relatively low skill, become a part of the union, and live a fairly good life for himself. They had a nice big brick house that I was able to visit a couple of times. I didn't know him, but I knew his long-term partner. Unlike Boggs, he's realizing all these younger Black guys are not going to have the same fortune. They're not going to have a chance to be integrated into the industrial economy in the same ways. And so basically what he says is that we have to think differently about questions of revolution in the country, right? His argument is that the US has already reached, and there's limitations to it, but the US has reached at that point a level of technological advancement that the problem is no longer one of scarcity. There's enough stuff to go around for everybody. Again, thinking about the consumer society and what it provides, that the issue is one of the values of the society, right? How things are distributed, that's a bigger issue for Boggs. He also pushes back against those who say what's needed is more training. And he argues in 63 that just as quickly as you train people for new jobs, those jobs will be disappeared by new technology. And he's not a technophobe or some sort of Luddite. He actually believes that this technology can be great if it's dispensed and organized under more democratic, means, like radically democratic means. So what he's calling for in large part in that book, and it's a really slim volume if you want to take a look at it, what he's calling for is a separation of this idea that you should be, that wage labor should be the means by which you're able to purchase the basic things that you need. And that people's right to life, to housing, food, healthcare, all these other things should not be attached to work. It should not be attached to, how much money you make or your capacity to earn a wage. So that brings me back to this question of relative surplus population, which is kindred with his ideas about expendables and unemployables, untouchables, and what have you, right? This is an image of a gang in Long Beach, California, on the east side, Longos. I think at one point they said there were as many as like 70,000 gang members just in Los Angeles alone, which doesn't include Long Beach. But part of what I'm arguing in the book, right, is that we need to think about those persons who we see in those viral videos, not just simply as, victims of racism, which they may be very well, be in certain instances, but we should think about them as having something else in common that's tougher to see in a viral video. But we need to read the context. So whenever there's a police killing that becomes a flashpoint of organizing, two things happen. On the one side, you see the Fraternal Order of Police step in and try to denigrate the victim, right? It's guaranteed. He was a thug, had a criminal conviction, he was this, he was that, right? This happens. And on the other side, activists who try to push a different narrative, right? This person was a family man, this person had a whole host of friends, they volunteered somewhere, or, they paint a different picture of them. And both pictures can be true, but the interpretation is what matters, right? If we think about some of the high profile cases of the last 5 or 6 years, right? George Floyd, what was he doing? He was allegedly trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. He was also in Minneapolis because he had been a part of a program for people who are in recovery, who are trying to restart their lives and find gainful employment. That's why he was in Minnesota. Walter Scott, who was shot in the back by North Charleston police. Why was he being pursued? He had a warrant out for unpaid child support. Freddie Gray, who was arrested and he died en route to the police station, or he went into needed medical attention en route to the police station. He died a few weeks later. What was he doing? He had been involved in petty drug dealing. That was true of other victims as well. Alton Sterling, he's selling used CDs in front of a gas station. Eric Garner in Staten Island, he's selling loosies. You buy a pack of cigarettes, you sell each one individually, right? Rayshard Brooks, who's a person in Atlanta who was killed in the midst of the George Floyd protests, right? He was a person who was on his way home after he says that. And unfortunately, that didn't happen for him. We should be able to talk about these people's lives, right? You don't have to be the fraternal orders who wants to drag somebody for what happened to them. We should be able to think about the society in this regard. Like, why are so many people struggling to make it? That they have to rely on selling loosies or selling a little bit of cannabis. Why is it legitimate in this country at this particular moment where one person can get arrested for selling cannabis in one state? I mean, there's still people in my home state of Louisiana for marijuana possession, right? But yet in California, I can go down to one main drag by my house and there's 3 dispensaries, right? That's unjust. We should be able to talk about these things in economic terms, not just simply in the most readily apparent ways. This is the common thread that unites the Longos. It unites many of the victims we've talked about in terms of police violence. I think it unites pretty much all of the people who are right now incarcerated. And it's not just a problem that we can focus on racist policing to resolve. It points to a massive level of dysfunction in the society that we need to reckon with. All right, so what is to be done about the police, right? There's different, minds here. I want to go through a few. Let's talk about reform. Let's talk about abolition. And let me give you another type of abolition that I think is probably better. So what Black Lives Matter did, and it did a lot. I've had back and forths with people who, think that, well, nothing happened. It's common to hear people say that. Nothing happened after George Floyd. Some things did happen. Many things happened, to be honest, right? And we need to recognize that. Whether they actually put a dent in the rate of police killings is another matter. But we do need to, acknowledge the fact that many changes took place. So one thing that Black Lives Matter has done since it's come into being, right, it's actually helped to give momentum to a lot of criminal justice reform campaigns that were already in motion, right, years before the killing of Trayvon Martin. So it's given in some states, not everywhere, because we had this patchwork of jurisdictions, right? In some places, we've seen, better training initiatives instituted. We've seen better screening of officers. What long-term impact it might have, requires study. But of course, we can do so much more, right? We also saw this, and I want to talk about this just because one guy, I've been arguing with this guy over the last week about this, right? We saw a lot of symbolic stances against racism during the summer of 2020. In my position, I was critical of like the corporate outpouring. I thought that was just gross in a lot of ways, and I said it, right? I said it and I stand by that. But I think there's also something important about the George Floyd moment that we should maybe reconsider, right? I think it was certainly opposition to what happened to him. We should also think about that huge, outpouring of protests in the summer of 2020 as opposition or rejection of the climate produced by the Trump administration. I mean, that's a part of the picture as well. And that's an important part. Another thing that I said back then, and I'll say it again, is that we don't really know what impact that summer had on people at an everyday personal level, right? I mean, we should be cautious about the corporate, corporations swooping down with a ton of money to give away. But at the same time, right, there were moments where we saw protest demonstrations operating in their best form as like civic schools, right? Many people became activists in that moment. Many people began to pay attention to politics in that moment. Some people saw their world differently in that particular moment, just by going to a demonstration that a friend or somebody else invited them to. I remember during the protests, I was walking up one of our streets in Oak Park, Illinois, suburb just adjacent to the Austin neighborhood of Chicago. And I saw it was a bunch of little white girls on the ground sidewalk with writing in chalk, Black Lives Matter, right? And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is like a nausea moment, something that somebody staged. But then also I thought, the better part of me was like, wait a minute, this is important, right? I'd rather see this than, people throwing tomatoes at a kindergartner who's trying to integrate a school in New Orleans, right? In the 1960s, right? We're a long way from that. If we now have kids who are on their own, there's no parents around who are deciding what kinds of things, what sort of values they want to have. And we don't know how that's going to manifest like later on in their lives, right? Or even right now, given that that's 3 years ago. So I'm trying to be a better person in how I think about it. Of course, there's abolition, right? And defund. And I want to talk briefly about those positions and why I think they're important, but maybe limited in some ways. This is actually a mural you can't see the other part of it. There's like the official mural that was put up by Muriel Bowser, who was the mayor of Washington, D.C., that said Black Lives Matter in the middle of the street. And then these other activists came by and like, yeah, Black Lives Matter equals defund the police, right? So they were trolling her and trolling the official line of symbolic support in that moment. I think that there's some right sizing that needs to happen, right? There's some departments that are over budget, overfunded, and ineffective. One good example is Chicago, right, which has a bigger police department than Los Angeles, but has more in the way of homicides at this point. What's being gained by the amount of money we're spending in Chicago on police? There are other places where we could argue they may be a justification for the size of police department that they have. But I think that some right sizing should happen. And one thing we saw in the way of reform after the George Floyd protests, some jurisdictions began to at least explore the idea of using nonviolent, unarmed units to respond to mental health crises. And I think that's important, right? I won't give all the details, but I spent like the last 2 weeks dealing with a situation where one of my oldest friends, a couple I've been knowing for 30 years, their son was arrested after a mental health emergency, and is now facing, charges. Right, he should not have been arrested. Right, that situation should have been de-escalated and could have been dealt with in other ways. And so I am in agreement with some Black Lives Matter elements when it comes to demilitarization and right sizing of police departments. But on this matter of abolition, right, we should abolish the police. I don't agree, right? And here's why. I think it's naive, right? Or at least just bad understanding of how governance works. How do you have, it's a question to the audience, how do you have a society that's as large and complex and as urban as ours without some legitimate use of force? And who gets to carry that out? I've had grad students tell me we should end qualified immunity, right, for police officers. I'm like, well, who would want to be a police officer? If I know I got to tackle some guy who just robbed someone else, but that guy can sue me, right, for tackling him, why would I want to become a police officer and be vulnerable to that kind of lawsuit or potential jail time, right, for my actions on behalf of the state? So there's that conundrum. How do you have the kind of society that we have and we want and many of us enjoy without some legitimate use of state force? It's also naive and maybe too selective histopro and their repression of Black activists. So that's real. That's an important part of the picture. But you also have the interventions of federal marshals into the Deep South, National Guard, even the 82nd Airborne Division of the U.S. Army at various points to force Southerners, to force segregationists to accept, Black participation in elections, in public accommodations, all sorts of areas where they were restricted or excluded from before. And so I think there's a more complicated relationship that we need to think about. The problem for us is that police uphold an incredibly unjust order, and they are the persons we've charged with managing, again, the most desperately poor and excluded in the society. So what's the alternative? What I argue in the book is that we should certainly push for criminal justice reforms. We've got to reverse a lot of the damage that was done by the war on drugs. I don't want to hear about any state, legalizing cannabis if they don't exonerate all the people who are in prison as a result of it, right? That's totally unfair to start this big big industry and then allow people to rot for the same thing when it was a crime. I think that any state that does it and doesn't include that is just not acceptable. So we got to reverse the problems of, not just the war on drugs, but this built up and bloated carceral system that we have. We should also focus on decriminalization of various activities, right? Decriminalization of the poor, decriminalization of various forms of work, sex work, selling drugs. All these things are forms of work that are people are punished as a result of. We can also do things like reduce fines and fees that actually constitute an informal poverty tax. Parking tickets, red light tickets, speeding tickets that are issued now through automation. These things are a burden on the poor, and they actually set people up for further, punishment if they're unable to pay. And then a couple other things that are old from the old social democratic playbook. Decommodification. This is kind of going along with the ideas that we heard from James Boggs, right? My right to basic needs shouldn't be connected to wage labor. And there's ways that we can move in the direction of decommodification. And then the last thing that I really push for in the book in one chapter, public works, a revitalized, revamped, reimagined notion of public works. Let me say a little bit about decommodification, how this could work. Let's just take housing as an example, right? A place like Los Angeles, where I've been for the last year, is unlivable, right? I mean, California in general is unaffordable. And you see it, you literally see it on the streets, right? You go from, just in most days, I go from places where I see massive, beautiful houses that should be like in Dwell magazine or, wherever, different architecture magazines, to seeing people who are like sleeping on the sidewalk. And that exists in a lot of cities, but in LA, it reaches like apocalyptic levels. I mean, everywhere you go, right? No part of the city is excluded from, a homeless or unhoused presence. And there's ways that we can address that. Now, of course, that is only one face of the unhoused, right? There are many people who are couch surfing, many people who are living with other folks, they don't have an address. That is homelessness, right? And it's not just a financial issue for many people, right? You need other kinds of supports and interventions. But there is a way that we can make cities more affordable, and we can begin to break this process of it only being available to those who can pay. You can have things like rent controls that reduce the cost that people spend on housing in cities. A combination of things: rent controls, cooperative housing, community land trusts, viable and well-funded public housing, things that have worked in other places and other times, things that have worked in specific parts of the United States. There's a way that we can combine those to slowly begin to decommodify housing, right? Or make it available to people, even if they don't have the resources, right? So much that we can do. There's great examples like Co-op City in New York, which has housed working class people for decades and provided access to New York City, allowed them to be able to live in New York City under conditions that are sustainable and affordable. So ideas like that matter. As far as public works, I spent a lot of time talking about this in the book. This illustration is pictures from a recent project that was opened by Los Angeles Transit Ambassadors. They hired about 300 young people to patrol, the unarmed patrols on trains and platforms, to provide a physical presence to deal with medical emergencies and other things that might be happening, right? And that's one way you can think about some sort of public works program, right? That may not hire everybody. You might not be able to hire everybody, but you can hire people who need work, but their skills, their other, their preparedness might not be ready for the job market as it exists. It's also a way that we can begin to create value in cities that's not connected to exchange value, right? Provide services and other things that people need that, Silicon Valley and whoever else is not concerned about because they're not going to make money off of it. You can also think about, if we go back to the examples of the Works Progress Administration, there's some things that we can do with public labor, publicly financed, publicly managed labor that are priceless. My favorite example from the Federal Writers Project was the oral history project they did on people who had been formerly enslaved. They did this in the 1930s, right? Went around interviewing Black people in their 70s and 80s who had been kids and teenagers in the last years of antebellum slavery. If you go online right now, after you get out of here, search for it, you can listen to their voices, telling their story, what it was like, what was a typical day like, what were their families like, right? That's something that you can do, things like that, which are priceless, right? If we hadn't done that in the 1930s, we wouldn't have it now. And it's not something that people who are looking to make, a profit off of it may not have been concerned about the stories of, these octogenarian Black people in the South. So I think it's important that we think in those terms. There's a lot of things that we can pursue. Now, what it's going to take is more than protests, right? We actually have to think about building true majorities in the country. I'm still in the honeymoon phase right now, because we just elected Brandon Johnson as the mayor of Chicago. I'm optimistic. A friend of mine said recently when I did an interview with her that I was more optimistic than I had been about a lot of things, right? It wasn't just because of him, it's because of what he represents, right? That for ever since I moved to Chicago, like in 2011, We've been looking for some other representation in city government that we just don't have. We didn't have it under Rahm Emanuel. We didn't have it under Lori Lightfoot. But somebody who represents the broader, more progressive corners of Chicago, which has been the epicenter of teachers union organizing, university professor and graduate student organizing, Black Lives Matter organizing, right? And we hadn't quite seen that reflected back to us in the kinds of candidates, but slowly we've been electing more socialist and progressive left candidates to the city council. It's just general information. I also want to show the credits, sort of like the movie credits. Even if you don't read them, they have to be shown. Where I got some of these photos from. All right, questions, thoughts? Go ahead, Rashad.
Thank you. I really love the.
Yeah. So about the abolitionist part, let me start with that. So there's various points in the book where I engage, Ruth Gilmore and other folks. And, she was one of the first people to, in her descriptions of the carceral expansion in California, to rely on a surplus labor, surplus land, right? So she uses a lot of those concepts. So, there's a debt there. I talk about her. I mentioned Stuart Hall, right, and his work with the Birmingham School, which talks about policing the crisis. So yeah, I don't see my work as completely antagonistic to abolition. And the reason I start out the presentation today is to show you, right, in terms of a friend of mine who sees herself as abolitionist, that there's some things that we want. The issue for me is the transitional space, right? How do you get from here to there? And I think the difference that I see in some of the manifestation of abolitionism is the role of the state, right? Like, what role should the state play? What should be the relationship between social movements and the state? And so that's the place where I'm willing to have more of a discussion, if not debate with people. I'm not quite sure about some of the presentations or ideas about restorative justice. I mean, there's a lot of great work that's been done in juvenile courts with restorative justice, but whether or not that can be scaled up in important ways is something I want to hear more about. So I see it as we're on the same side, but maybe not necessarily seeing things the same way. And part of my bias comes from not just the Marxist socialist part of it, but also just the political scientist part of me, which is like, how do we govern? How do we deal with these things on a broader level? So there's that. As far as like the Black Lives part, I mean, where I would disagree, right, is that when we think about the making of the carceral moment, right, it's not, and I could have gone into more detail here, there are many contributions that Black communities, Black politicians made to the making of the carceral apparatus that we had. And I say that not to treat them as though they were evil, right? I mean, in many cases, they had real concerns, right? They wanted to get the, hypodermic needles out of the park, in the corner where their kids play. They wanted to get rid of people who were, firing off shots in the middle of the night in their neighborhoods. And their actions, in many cases, created unintended consequences, right? So in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, and Detroit. So I try to talk about those things because for me, and this is maybe where I disagree, for me, the issue is interest, right? For me, the issue is position. Where do you stand on these particular issues? Because when we look at politics up close, especially in these carceral matters, sometimes we got Black people on both sides of them, right? And that's where I'm hesitant to not talk about a Black experience of it in the same ways. In the case of one of the last terrible incident in Memphis, 5 black police officers involved. And I'm not saying the way the right wing would say it, which is right? It's not racism because you have, but to say that it's a complicated thing. Like what the hell is wrong with these people, right? That they did this. And I'm willing to believe that in other contexts, they may have thought that, that they are, they're also oppressed or excluded and discriminated against. So I guess I'm in my own work, I'm trying to deal with the, the actually existing elements, like where people stand, what are their positions, what they're really expressed or real interest might be, And so like with the case of Brandon Johnson's election, I mean, disappointing, but look at the people on the other side, right? Who came out, people like Bobby Rush endorsed for all intents and purposes, the Republican candidate, right? A long ways from the Illinois Black Panther Party, right? So again, I think my focus has always been on interests, like what are the expressed interests, what are the interests that are in motion historically, and where people stand. And in saying that, it makes it difficult for me to talk about a Black experience or a Black interest, right? Given those realities, the empirical realities of it.
Chicago and LA all the time. But case closure rates have been plummeting for 30 years.
Right.
Police forces are building new training centers, which are not about solving crimes. They're about repressing uprisings.
Right.
In Minneapolis,
kids are just sitting in labs untested and unused for sure.
In the case of Minneapolis, where George Floyd passed the counterfeit bill was to a criminal enterprise, which the police had known was a criminal enterprise for 20 years and had never done anything about it. While I was there, they did a carjacking sweep that lasted 3 weeks, a multi-agency task force, and they corralled 51 people, and they had a big news conference celebrating it. And this was a response to what they said was the disorder caused by the George Floyd uprising.
Right.
They arrested 51 people after 3 weeks or whatever policing. They ended up charging 5, all for drug possession. Not a single carjacking prosecution. So,
right.
If you're looking at interests, one of the ways that you can diagnose interest is by working from what you presume the logical things to do based on a particular social position would be. That's one way. Another way is to take seriously what people do. And I think where the difference is with the abolitionist argument, which I think Rashad was hinting at when he was being polite, but I think he was hinting at it at the end of his comments, is if you look at what people do, you can view the Chauvins as bad apples. But what most abolitionists view it is actually this is what it's about.
Yeah, of course.
And if they're acting in their interest, the idea that they're playing a functional role to provide social control is actually a misdiagnosis of their role. Right. Their role is actually repression, or their role is control through arbitrary authority and violence. Right. So, when George Floyd was murdered, what Marsha would say is, I wasn't out there for Floyd. I didn't know Floyd, but I lost 6 of my former students to that corner.
Right.
And she lost another one during the uprising. Right. And the police are involved in all of this. And from that perspective, police aren't solving crimes. What they're providing is repressing that post-industrial population that you're talking about.
Right. Was exactly what I said, right?
but if that's true, if that's actually the role, then you don't reform it.
Yeah, but so here's the thing. Let's talk about that. You said what police do, and you listed off a laundry list of horrific things that police do.
Well, horrific, but not exceptional.
They're not exceptional, right? I mean, in the book, in the conclusion, I actually talk about Nicole Siegel's work, where she talks about police as violence workers, right? Even earlier in the book, I start out by saying that the very purpose of police is to create the conditions for capital accumulation that shifts from various historical moments to the other. But I'm not making a functionalist argument that we need police in order to police crimes, right? I'm saying that the crimes that they are policing are in fact part of the problem of our society, right? That people have to rely on criminalized forms of work in order to survive, right? But back to the point of what police do, most of what police do on a day-to-day basis never makes the news, right? If there's a car accident, police show up in that spot, right? They're the first ones on the spot. They cover up dead bodies. They deal with people who in trauma situations. They deal with domestic violence. I'm not saying that they resolve or solve those problems, but they manage all sorts of problems in society, so the rest of us don't have to, right? That's the reality of policing. It's not something that will go away, right? So on the one hand, as I'm arguing that the problem of policing surplus population is one problem of our society in this historical moment, right? As we've abandoned welfare as a way of addressing the desperately poor, right? We've relied on police. That's a problem. But there are other problems, and this is maybe where I disagree with abolitionists, right? I think that, some of these problems are not going to go away. I don't think that murder as a phenomenon just started with capitalism, right? It's not a phenomenon that just started with modern society. It's always been a part of how human beings interact with each other, right? We can be brutal, we can be unfair to each other. And I'm not suggesting that police should be there to handle those problems. But again, how do you have some territorial form of power or sovereignty without the legitimate use of violence, right? Whether it is to defend from external forces, right, who might try to contest it, or internal, threats. So let me give you another example. Even if we think about in terms of democratic socialism or socialism of our, our desires, what we want to see, you still have to be able to protect that society from its alternatives, right, from its opposition. And there's been clear examples, especially in this post-war period, if we go international, where you had countries that had set up regimes that were about spreading literacy, right, providing fresh water to people, redistributing wealth, controlling various resources, whether it was mines or whatever else that had been now taken back from foreign capital, right? In order to maintain those societies, they needed to have military and police. The ones that didn't last very long, right? Think about it. How many societies throughout the so-called third world that initiated some form of post-colonial socialism that were ultimately overthrown by US CIA operatives or some combination of local forces, military, and others who were able to overturn them? In those cases, you have to defend, the good society from those who may try to overturn it, right? So I think even in the global context, right, you're trying to say we can have a society without legitimate use of force. This is maybe one of the distinctions I have with the abolitionists, including, Angela Davis and others. I just don't see. And then one thing that people always say is they're like, well, of course you don't see it because we haven't gotten to it yet, right? And that once we get to this place where we don't need it anymore, then we'll be able to have this society that doesn't have to rely on pervasive violence. But for me, I'm not willing to bank on that, right? I actually think that we do need to have some force in place. And again, where's the transitional space? How do we go from over-policing of surplus population, all manner of corruption that you just pointed out, and some other much more just, society? I don't know. Maybe some other people have the response. Maybe Mike wants a rejoinder.
I'm not sure I have a resolved position on all aspects of this.
Go ahead.
But I want to take it in a different direction. So first, I think it's worth keeping in mind that you're making two different arguments about what is ultimately needed to have a society run well, and about the transitional space. So what's the story at the New York mayoral election or something is a transitional space argument. And what majority can be brought along in a political transformation, different argument. And I sort of see a point there that is different from however you resolve can we, by means of Marxist Leninism, get to a point where we can all be anarchists? Okay, but still got this transition. So let me pose the question slightly differently as what do you get if you abolish the police? So we've got a public policing system in a troubled political relationship with city governments and funding and the national supply of weaponry and all this sort of thing. But it's public. So the reform gambit is, well, at least it's public, so we potentially can reform.
What I talk about in chapter 6 of the book, I deal directly with police as a occupation, right? The chapter's called The Labor of Occupation. And one of the things that I see that may be, as daunting as full-on privatization is the technological intensification of policing or capital intensive policing, which is already happening, right? Whether it's data mining, the use of big data as a way to address problems. Maybe the scariest version is robotics, right? You know, like the Boston Dynamics police dogs that are being used, piloted in different places. Los Angeles, I think the state police in Massachusetts also use those same dogs. So we can see, you know, the same trajectories, right? Where in order to deal with public pressure or to offset public pressure, in order to get away from some of the problems of sworn officers being prosecuted for crimes, you can see some departments moving towards, you know, other means as a way to reduce the culpability that comes with sworn officers. But not all departments, right? I think some just can't afford the technology. Some don't even have body cameras yet, so we can't imagine them taking on some of these new technologies. But I just think that yeah, we should be aware of what's going on, right? During the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline, I think it was South Dakota that actually approved the use of weaponized drones. We also saw back in 2016, the same year that Philando Castile was killed in St. Paul and Alton Sterling at same time, the first use of a robot to end a police standoff in Dallas, Texas, right? They actually equipped a bomb that was supposed to be to detonate, robot that was used to detonate bombs was then used to deliver a payload in the case of a sniper in Dallas. So, you know, these things are already happening. They're already being experimented with, and we need to pay attention to what that all looks like. But I could certainly see, you know, in the time of austerity and people calling it they don't really have enough money, privatization along with, you know, capital intensification can be two easy responses that we see from especially larger departments. Ben.
I have a question of your, I don't want to, if we have to put it down. Okay.
Or the second last.
I have a separate question. I wanted to arbitrate the conversation between Rashad, Michael, and you just a second ago. I think part of the difficulty here is that you're responding to different threads in the conversation. So, you know, the sort of Michelle Alexander new Jim Crow story is different from the kinds of motivations that behind like abolish the police, which is different from the NBA, like taking on like racial justice as a complete issue, right? So there's a lot of different things that you're situating yourself in relation to. And I guess one way of asking the question is it that you're really situating yourself against any of these things per se, or that you're trying to inject some more reality into the conversation, just in terms of baseline facts about what's going on? Because it seems like a lot of it, like so much of your talk was dedicated to the fact that very important details are being erased under very flat narratives of you know, the various sort of things that you talked about. So is it that you're trying to inject some reality into the conversation as a place from which to talk about concrete reforms, or are there things that you're concretely against? I mean, you know, the sort of corporatization of racial justice obviously stands as like one role there, but are there other things that you think are dangerous or sort of pernicious tendencies in coming to real solutions? Right. I guess I can ask the other question over dinner. Okay. All right. Did you want to ask your question? I'll respond to both of them. Okay. Yeah. So I think I do have objections to some of the racial justice or race-centric arguments. And again, I was trying to summarize a lot of different aspects of the book, right? So there's some moments where I do take on directly, you know, here's a problem with the new Jim Crow. The issue for me and what I was trying to lay out in this particular talk is that where do these interpretations take us, right? Because the moment you frame the problem in a particular way, you also begin to think about specific kinds of solutions, right? So if people see this primarily, and we hear it over and over again, things like, so take for instance, the big pharma CEO, Black CEO, Ken Frazier, right? In the midst of the George Floyd protests,
he says to the public, this could have happened to me, right? As a Black man, right? And of course, it would not have happened to him. It will not happen to him. He will never go to prison, right? He will never, or it's highly unlikely that he will be killed by police. Of course, it can possibly happen, but the chances are so very small that this person who is a part of the 1% is going to find himself in a conflict with police. So the issue for me is that the anti-racist argument, even though it's right, even though it comes from a particular historical place, right? During the 1980s, it was one of the first responses, first ways of talking about mass incarceration. It was also limited at the time, right? It didn't capture so many other things that were happening. And the way that we continue to use it now, even as the numbers are shifting, right? Some of the fastest growing populations, especially as a result of the opioid crisis, are, white working class folks who are being in prison at a rate that's almost as high as the rates of Black men in prisons are declining, right? So if that's the case, then we need a different frame, and we're looking at a very different problem, right? It's not a problem that can be rectified through better police training, through implicit bias training, through hiring more Black officers, but instead it's a problem of the society and the way in which we've chosen to deal with the desperately poor, right? And so, again, my argument in the end is basically more social democracy, if not socialism, as a way of dealing with this problem versus more policing. So slightly different, but trying to cram it all in. It's like 400 pages, so trying to get it all in one talk is rough.
That's a great segue to my question. I hope it's on, but I'm curious, the conversation, the pieces you had about policing surplus population. I was wondering in the book if you also offer a kind of a gender analysis. I'm particularly thinking about police, the ways I think about policing women's bodies around reproduction. So I just was, I'm thinking about during that same time period, you had state-sanctioned eugenics programs that police Black and particularly poor Black and brown women, Indigenous women's, transnational women's bodies and reproduction. So I didn't know if you take up policing beyond like literal policing, because that's the frame for reproductive justice perspective.
Right.
And, related to that, even as you talked about criminal justice reform, being able to kind of flag and signal the criminalization of folks like the crack epidemic, like that shows up often not in jail systems and but also in like child welfare systems as those families were dismantled, So I just was wondering if you pull upon or draw any of those parallels around gender in the book.
Yeah, not so much. I'm focused more so on formal policing at best. Vigilante violence, makes an appearance at various places in the book, but it's more so, using the focus of Black Lives Matter on people who are typically unarmed, African American who are killed in conflicts with police, focusing on that and then moving towards a discussion about the carceral apparatus more generally is with the direction I went. As far as like the debate, but also what do we need to do next? And for me, going through a lot of these different arguments, the focus on the problem of surplus population, which I see as one of the limitations of the second Reconstruction, right? We were able to, engage in some level of integration of Black people in society culturally. Rashad mentioned that culturally and politically, and in so many different institutions. But what we didn't do was address these hardcore problems of poverty, which many civil rights activists talked about during the 1960s, right? And sought to provide various solutions to. We know A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and the Freedom Budget, Martin Luther King trying to mobilize the Poor People's Campaign, and his proteges, tried to carry that out after his assassination. But I think, many civil rights activists were openly discussing the limitations of liberal reforms during the 1960s. And it's up to us at this particular moment to then begin to think again, especially in light of Black Lives Matter, what needs to be done to address, deep inequalities.
Thanks.
All right.